If you're trying to conceive and quietly wondering if life can be whole without a baby, feeling anxious, uncertain, or weary in your faith, you're not alone. Welcome to the Infertility and Trying to Conceive podcast for Christian women. I'm Lyndell Renee, an Aussie wife, mum, and follower of Jesus. Here I share biblical truth, simple conception tips, offer emotional support, and have honest conversations about what struggling to conceive really looks like as a Christian woman. My prayer is that this podcast lightens your load, keeps you anchored in Christ, and helps you move forward with confidence, peace, and hope. Christ goes before you, and I'm right here helping you look to Him every step of the way. Let's begin. Hi, I'm so glad you're able to join me today. I wanted to spend some time in Psalm 20 because it's a psalm that has some really relatable words when you're struggling and in the throes of infertility and loss. These phrases can be common go-tos or they can get shared with really good intentions. And they sound really hopeful and reassuring. They say things like, may He give you the desire of your heart. May all your plans succeed. Fulfill all of your purposes. These are strong words, and if you're in a season where your body feels unreliable, your future feels uncertain, and your prayers just feel unanswered, those words don't just feel like theory. They might be something that you desperately hold on to. And so before we go any further, I want to say this clearly. If you've read verses like those in Psalm 20 and wondered, is this speaking into my life and my fertility struggles right now? Those thoughts are natural. They come from hope, from longing, from wanting to finally get a positive result or some good news after so much waiting. And that matters because it shows your heart is engaged and that your hope is alive even in the uncertainty. So confusion around psalms like this doesn't come from a lack of faith. Often confusion comes from reading them through a modern lens and expecting them to carry the full weight of our personal circumstances, especially when we're longing for something that hasn't actually happened yet. So today I want to gently walk through why reading these verses as promises for our own outcomes can create confusion, but also how they can point us to a deeper, steadier hope that God provides. And so understanding that starts with seeing the psalm in its original context, a public prayer for the king before he went into battle. It's not written to an individual trying to figure out what their personal calling is. It's spoken by a group of people for their king, right before he goes into battle. And that timing is important. This prayer isn't spoken after success, not after victory, not after everything has worked out. It's spoken before anyone knows how it's going to end. So there's real risk here, real danger and a real possibility of loss. So when the people pray for protection, answered prayer or fulfilled desire, or even successful plans, purpose and victory, they're not claiming certainty. They're entrusting the situation to God without knowing the outcome. The king isn't just going into danger for himself because he actually represents the people in the biblical times. If he falls, they're vulnerable. If he's defeated, their future is shaken. So underneath all of these requests is one deeper plea. God, stay with him. Don't leave him. Because if you stay with him, you're staying with us. And if you read it aloud, that plea feels urgent and raw, almost like the people are holding their breath for the outcome. And that's the center of the psalm. So when we hear words like protection, desire, plans, purpose, and victory, we often don't actually, we don't picture a battlefield. We picture our lives. Protection starts to mean, being spared another negative test, or making it through a pregnancy without loss, or not having to face one more medical appointment. If we consider desire, that might be, desiring the child that you've prayed for, or the sibling that you hoped to give your first child, or the family that you've imagined when you were younger. If you consider plans and purpose, that might become the life that you thought you'd have by now, or the sense that your years are being used well, or even just the fear that infertility has, derailed everything. Victory then becomes an ending, a relief, or a sense that this season didn't win. And so, of course, Psalm 20, it feels personal, especially when infertility already makes your world feel small and repetitive. With, tracking cycles, waiting for results, explaining to friends, bracing yourself for another month. Hearing lines like, may He give you the desire of your heart and make all your plans succeed. Maybe shout for joy over your victory. This can hit differently. Those words are hopeful, but when we bring them straight into our own personal struggles, it's easy to misread them as promises for our immediate circumstances. And the tension here isn't that you're hoping too much. It's that Psalm 20 often gets asked to carry a weight that it wasn't meant to carry. This psalm, it's not a promise that the battle will go well. It's offering trust before the battle is fought. And that distinction matters because when we read it as a guarantee, unanswered prayers feel like failure, either our failure or God's failure. But when we read it as trust before the outcome, the unanswered prayers, they do still hurt, but they don't automatically mean that you've been abandoned. And I know that that doesn't make the pain smaller, but it does change what the pain means. And Scripture is full of faithful people who didn't get immediate outcomes. This tension isn't only unique to us. Think about Hannah. She prayed for a child year after year. She was faithful, she was honest, and she was deeply distressed. But for a long time, nothing changed. God wasn't absent, but he was silent. Or Elizabeth, she was described as righteous, faithful, and she was barren most of her life. The longing didn't mean that God had forgotten her, but it also didn't mean that the answer came quickly. Or David himself, the kind of king that Psalm 20 would have been prayed for. He was anointed long before he was established as king. There were years of waiting and danger and exile and fear, but being chosen also didn't mean that he avoided hardship. So Psalm 20 is anchoring hope to God's presence being with his people, not just giving them a specific outcome. The people are saying, if God stays with the one who represents us, then even if this costs us more than we expect, we are not lost. That's the security that they're holding on to. Even though you're not standing on a battlefield, that core question also hasn't changed. Because when infertility drags on, when hope feels exhausting, when you're tired of being strong, the question underneath it all is still, God, are you still with me? Or am I on my own now? And this psalm answers that question by showing that God's presence doesn't depend on the outcome. The people aren't asking for an easy victory. They're asking God to stay with them in the fight, even if the battle is hard, even if the result is uncertain. God is faithful to be present. And you can hear this concretely in verse 7. It says, some trust in chariots, some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. Here you can feel their tension, their hope, their fear all at once. Even with danger in front of them, they anchor themselves not in the strength of armies, but in God's presence. And so in essence, Psalm 20 is saying, God, don't abandon your anointed one in the battle. And if we look at the gospel, it shows us that this prayer was fully answered, just not in the way anyone expected. It shows us that Jesus, the true King, goes into suffering on our behalf. He enters the battle of loss, rejection, physical pain, and death. And when he does, he doesn't just represent himself, he represents us. When Jesus is raised from the dead, we hear that promise in a new way. God never abandons, even when the cost is highest. Because Christ was not abandoned. Even in death, we know that God does not walk away from his people. Not when life is fruitful, not when it's barren, not when prayers are answered in the way that we hoped, and not when they aren't answered in the way we can see or understand. That doesn't mean God gives us everything that we ask for, but it does mean that our suffering is never proof that he has left us. And knowing God never abandons us doesn't take away the pain that we feel. It simply reminds us that even in uncertainty, loss, and unanswered prayers, we're not alone. And this doesn't mean that unanswered prayers or deeply longing for a baby, that it doesn't matter. Because the truth is, the desire for a child is good. It's human, it's biblical. And Psalm 20 isn't asking you to stop wanting. It's a reminder that God's faithfulness isn't measured by whether or not the outcome you desperately want comes about in your timeline or how you want it to. It's offering a steadier hope. It's not offering everything will turn out the way I want, but it is offering I'm not abandoned. My life is not on hold in God's eyes. This pain is not evidence that God has left. That's not flashy hope, but it is solid. So if you want, you're welcome to sit with some of these questions, not to answer them perfectly, but just to notice what comes up. So when you hear Psalm 20 talk about protection, desire, plans, purpose, and victory, which of those feels the most hardest for you right now? And secondly, have you ever felt like unanswered prayers were telling you something about God's nearness or his distance to you? Number 3, what does it feel like to hear that God's presence is not proven by getting everything you desire, but by the fact that He will never abandon you. And number 4, is there a place in your story where you've quietly wondered, has God moved on from me? And what does it mean to hear that Christ's resurrection actually answers that question? So if you're listening and you're tired, really tired of disappointment, tired of confusion, tired of waiting, Psalm 20 is not asking you to try harder or believe better. It's not promising resolution, but it is reminding you that God does not leave His people. And sometimes the most honest prayer isn't actually, God, fix this. It's actually, God, please stay. And that prayer has already been answered by God in the fact that He didn't abandon Christ in His suffering. And because of that, He doesn't abandon you either, even here. Before you go, thank you so much for listening. I pray today's episode has brought you fresh hope for whatever comes next. If someone comes to mind today who could truly use support in this space, please share this episode or the podcast with them. It might be exactly what they need. And if you could take 30 seconds to give me a star rating or leave 1 or 2 sentences about what this podcast has meant to you on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, I'd be ever so grateful. Your feedback not only helps others find the podcast, but it truly makes my day. And words of affirmation are my love language. And if you're not sure how to do that, I'll pop the links in the show notes below. Lastly, although I do have a nursing degree, everything shared in this podcast is for inspiration and education only. Please don't use it as a replacement for advice from your personal, medical or mental health professional. There's absolutely no shame in getting additional support when you need it, but always consult your expert team before making any changes to your fertility journey. That's all from me today. Take care, and I'll catch you next time. Bye.